Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started here tonight at our work session to discuss the budget and budget schedule. I'm going to pass it over to City Manager Karen Kennard. Look forward to this presentation.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'm happy to be here with parts of the team, joined by Finance Director Judy Belanger, Deputy Finance Director Andrew Pergel. I can also share that Chief Newport and Karen Senecal from the PD are here, and Commissioner Scher. Great, wonderful. So I'm going to run the PowerPoint, so bear with me one moment. Okay. So you have in front of you this evening, and for those at home on the screen, the presentation. And it'll be a bit of a back and forth with Judy and myself, so bear with us. But we've developed it a little informally, and we want to have more of an informal conversation rather than a talking to the whole time. So if it makes sense, it's good to hold questions till the end, but if something's really driving you nuts, just holler. So what we would like to do tonight is walk you through the schedule as we know it. It's pretty prescriptive. Talk about what we're seeing for forecasting, and we don't have too many numbers defined yet. The ones we do have, we're happy to share, but many of them are still in development. And then we'll look forward to the discussion and to any public comment that might arise. So as a reminder, this is the way the budget unfolds. We are at the last meeting in January, as you see. The school board has already had one public hearing, and coming up in February, there will be school board public hearing number 2, followed by, along with the fire and the police in there, and they have their meetings fairly early. And by way of schedule, once we creep into March, Judy and Andrew and I will have met with all the departments to refine and understand how their budget's going to essentially go to print to come to you. And in and amongst that, we have the CIP adoption in March, which obviously helps inform the budget. We get you the budget on or before the last Friday in April. And then we have a series of meetings. May is a busy meeting month, as you can see. And then the goal is to adopt at the first regular council meeting in June. So Judy's going to speak to budget forecasting, but as I said, she and I may do a little bit of ping pong and back and forth and turn it into more of a conversation. So Judy, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Mayor and members of the City Council. I'm very happy to be here and to kind of walk through the budget process and give you some information that I hope will be new to you or helpful or a refresher of some of the information and how we handle budgets in Portsmouth. I guess I'll start right off with just reiterating the fiscal year 22 final budget. Our budget's broken down into 2 sections. We have the operating side and then the non-operating side for the general fund. And tonight we're just talking about the general fund. The operating budget consists of expenditures that are associated with the services that are provided to you by the school, the fire, and the police department. And that makes up about 78% of the total budget.
I'm going to go back, sorry.
The non-operating portion of the budget, which houses expenditures associated with your debt service, capital items, Rockingham County tax, this portion makes up about 22% of the total budget. The City Council adopted a budget at $123 million, or 3.44% over fiscal year 21. However, since the adoption, there were 2 supplemental appropriations funded from unassigned fund balance. One on the operating side for $116,000, and that was for the community campus operations. And the second one was $2.2 million for the first phase and design and construction of the skateboard park. So now this brings the total fiscal year 22 budget at $125,525,000. Or 5.28% over the previous year. Next slide, please. So in the state of New Hampshire, there's a handful of states that don't have a sales tax. There's a handful of states that don't have an income tax. But there's only 2 states in the country that have neither the income tax or the sales tax, and that's Alaska and New Hampshire. But as a result, for New Hampshire, what that results is that property taxes really is your primary method of financing local services. So we start with the expenditure side, which is the budget, which is what the city council adopts. So fiscal year 22 is 125 million. And then we look at revenues. So we do a lot of trending and comparisons, and we're really conservative on our revenue estimates. So our local revenues bring in about 21.9 million. State revenues, because of the lack of other taxes, is really only about $3.3 million. And then we also use fund balance, and every year we use a portion of fund balance to offset the taxes. So what this means is that, in simple math, is that you take your expenditures less your revenues, and that comes up with your tax levy. Calculating that against your property assessed values, then it calculates the tax rate. Now, the problem with this process here, too, is that budget is passed in June, so there's a lot of state revenues that we're unsure of at that time, and we're also unsure of the Rockingham County obligation, which is a big number. Property assessments are also not due to the state until September, October deadline. So we're kind of at a quandary there of trying to finalize exactly what the tax rate's going to be. So during the budget process, we'll talk about an estimated tax rate during that time. And then the tax rate is not set by the Department of Revenue until they're really kind of leaning into November now. It used to be earlier in October, but now it seems to be pushed into November. So that's when your tax rate will be finalized.
Switching to the next slide, this is where you all come in. And this slide has been used the last two budget cycles, and this slide was built around a previously agreed upon set of goals that, boy, they date back to before I even got here. So I think there was conversation about resetting goals, and then COVID hit, and then it was just sort of all hands on deck. So we're excited to be able to inform this page and the goals, as we talked about at our retreat on Saturday, with the things that you find to be important. So a slide like this with the philosophy behind the budget being a statement of values and what it is you find important will be informed by the goals we set Saturday, so we will update this page. But this was just to show that setting of goals really is critical to the whole budget conversation.
And also with building a budget, we want to not focus on the 1 year. It's very important to look out several years. What might occur in one fiscal year may have a significant impact, negatively or positively, going forward. So what we want to do is really avoid what we call break-even budget practices, which is having that fluctuation of going down and up and down and up and down and up. We want create a nice stable glide path to address all of the goals of the council in the city and still provide those services for the current fiscal year and for many years going forward. Next slide. So there's been a number of long-term financial policies, and I'd like to go over these because this is really how we build our current budget and our future budgets. Long-term planning assists in keeping the annual budget and the tax rate stable from year to year. So we have a number of policies that have been already in place, and I'll start with the overall, and we'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but just to list them. So taking into consideration the whole general fund, we have an unassigned fund balance policy, and I will explain that. On the operating side of the budget, to help with that stabilization, we have a leave at termination stabilization fund, we have the health insurance stabilization fund, and then we have a COLA adjustment kind of stabilization policy that we have in place. On the non-operating side, we have policies related to our capital projects, which will help also stabilize the budgets for the future, and our rolling stock replacement program. Now, these policies they've been put in place over a couple of decades now and really has put Portsmouth in a very strong financial position. These policies are incorporated in our budgeting forecasting approach, and it carries out over several years. These policies also has placed Portsmouth ahead of other communities and has put us in a better position when handling emergencies and like what we had just gone through with the pandemic. What I would like to mention, though, just a little side note, I had the privilege a few years back to speak at the New Hampshire Municipal Association workshop, and that topic was on budgeting. And I spoke in great detail about the importance of long-term planning, what Portsmouth had implemented. And I will say I was approached after that work session by town managers, by select board members, and other finance directors, and they were really impressed with what Portsmouth has achieved. And I'm hoping that we can create more and talk about more innovation for the budget going forward. So I'd like to start with the first one, fund balance. So what is fund balance? So this is a term that's used in governmental reporting for the general fund, and when we talk about the general fund, it's based on a modified basis of accounting and using current financial resources. So there's a balance sheet in your annual report, in your ACFR, and also in your PAFR that has the balance sheet specifically for the general fund, again on current financial resources. So when we talk about assets minus liabilities equals your fund balance, your assets are reported with no long-term, there's nothing long-term in the balance sheet. Is why it's called current financial sources. So there's no reporting of capital assets such as land or building, and there's no reporting of long-term liabilities such as debt service. This is very different than what you see in other financial statements when you're looking at a private sector or a major company. So fund balance then is really made up of 5 categories. There's non-spendable, which is what it says. You can't spend it. We do have a small amount on our non-spendable because several years ago we had loaned money to the trustees for the docks, so they gradually pay us back. But the balance of that is what they haven't paid back yet, so we have to reserve that in our fund balance in the event that they would default. And restricted fund balance is for grants or enabling legislation. Committed fund balance is where houses our reserves. Assigned is intended for a specific purpose, mostly our encumbrances, or sometimes during the budgetary process when the council decides to use unassigned fund balance. During that budgetary process, it would be moved to assigned before it gets moved up to a budget. And then, as we all talk about, is your unassigned fund balance, which we talk about that term a lot. And that is really not designated for any specific purpose and sometimes referred to as the rainy day fund or emergency fund, or just, as savings overall. So again, we'll talk about more of the committed fund balance, which houses your stabilization reserves, the health insurance, leave at termination, and the future debt service reserves. And then we'll talk about unassigned fund balance, which is can go right to the next page. So when we talk about an ordinance that was put on file many years ago, this was to recognize and to stay within a guideline between 10 and 17% of your unassigned fund balance. Now, this was amended in 2013 to refer to that 10 to 17%. Prior to that, it was more like 5 to 10%. So, what is the appropriate guideline for that range for your community? So there isn't any one specific number or guideline in this area. Really what GFOA and the rating agencies look at is it adequate for your community? So the 10 to 17% we felt was, pretty adequate for our area. If you were in an area where you had earthquakes or hurricanes or floods, then you would see those communities wanting to have a higher range of their unassigned fund balance. And also GFOA also references sometimes maintaining like 2 to 3 months of your operating budget in an unassigned fund balance. We really haven't approached that. That's probably more up to the higher 17%. But staying within the 10 and 17% has been working really well and demonstrated to work really well as we saw going through the pandemic, or still am going through the pandemic. The next slide shows the unassigned fund balance from FY15 to FY21. It's a total of $16.3 million, or 13.74% of appropriations. Now, that is as of June 30th. So we only close the books at the end of the year. So that's where your final numbers of fund balance and unassigned fund balance are kind of locked in. However, we just had 2 supplemental appropriations, which temporarily has brought that unassigned fund balance down to a level of 11.19%. So that doesn't mean that we're going to end the year with that. What that means is this is where we are right now. So at the end of the year, when we close, if there are surpluses, revenue surpluses, or expenditure surpluses, this would all fold back to one of the 5 categories in fund balance. So this 11.19%, we were, in comparison to the past, that's about a fiscal year 09 to a fiscal year 012 level, when we were slightly below 12% of unassigned fund balance. But really what Standard & Poor's, and we don't talk about this a lot, and I think that we should talk about this. Standard & Poor's really looks at not only your unassigned fund balance, but they look at your total fund balance, which are those 5 categories. And Standard & Poor's last reported to us in their report, it says, we expect the available fund balance to remain above 30% of expenditures for the current and next fiscal years, which we view as a positive credit factor. Doesn't mean that if you go below 30%, all of a sudden, boom, you lose your AAA rating, because there's a lot of factors that go into that. But they really want to know why and how you're gonna recoup that. If you go to the next slide, now again, when we use unassigned fund balance, it affects your total fund balance. So now we're down to about 34.87%. So what we want to do is just be careful going forward, look at our current budget, see where we're going to end up, and replenish some of this fund balance. Again, this 34.87% was back in about fiscal year 7, fiscal year 8, when we were in that range.
Judy?
Mm-hmm.
The 30%, or okay, it's on the slide, general fund. I just wanted to know if that included water and sewer. But
No, it's, yeah, just general fund.
Right.
Just the general fund. So use of fund balance. So, we do use fund balance every year. We utilize part of our reserves. We have the reserve for debt service that we utilize in our budget to really offset the tax rate. So this is just showing and demonstrating that we do use and we do maintain and we do follow and we do make sure that we stay within those ranges of fund balance of every year. So fiscal year 22 with the 2 supplementals, we have now utilized $4.7 million of fund balance to offset taxes in fiscal year 22. So now to move on to the Leave It Termination Stabilization Fund. Now this goes back to 1999. So what this means is this is leave payout to employees when they leave municipal services. So way back in the early 90s or prior to 1996, any employee of the city was able to accumulate an unlimited amount of sick time. And when you left service with the city, you would be paid out a percentage, and it depended on what union you were in, what percentage that would be. So what this was causing is just a large liability that was continuing to grow. And so back in the 90s, it was like, how can we mitigate that liability and kind of ease it out and grandfather the employees that were hired before 1996? And that's just the sick leave part, because annual leave is also paid out of the stabilization fund. Annual leave is, it is your earned time, and you are paid out if you don't utilize all your, to a max. There is a max on that as well. So what the steps that we're taking during this time through the negotiations of all the collective bargaining agreements was to eliminate any cash payout for any employee that was hired after 1996. And then the second piece of this was really to remove this liability from year to year within each individual department, because school, fire, and police and municipal had to figure out, okay, who's retiring this year? You know, one year they may need, you know, 300,000. The next year, then no one's retiring. So then they kind of have that little 300,000 to play. So we wanted to remove that from the departments, even though they're still funding a certain amount, but to remove those spikes and valleys, which also caused a budgeting nightmare for the departments, because you could have 5 people leaving. So those were the policies that were put in place. And how this works is there was an actuarial study done. We maintain it in-house. Started back in in the early 90s, and then and it's monitored throughout the time. Of course, things can change. Unexpected events could happen that can kind of swing this. So what the theory of this is, each department funds X amount of dollars. On July 1, that appropriation gets moved over to the stabilization fund. All of the payments are paid out of this fund, and at the end of the year, if they, actually we can use an example, so police department funds $180,000, but if they had to spend $300,000, it's paid out of the stabilization fund, the deficit is paid out of the reserve, fund balance reserve. But we put them all together, so it's a combination of fire, police, school, and municipal. So I want to jump to the next slide to try and clarify that a little bit, and then we'll come back to this one. So this next slide is the history of exactly what has happened. The blue line for each of the general government, school, fire, and police is the actual expenditure. So you can see it might spike one year, it might drop another year. So the blue line is your actual expenditure, and the orange line is what was budgeted within those departments. So again, at the end of the year, if there was surplus in that fund, it would fold back into fund balance. If there was a deficit, it would be used from the reserve to cover those costs. So the theory about this is that the liability has reduced significantly. Going forward, it will become more manageable as we move forward. There'll always be a leave at term, but once the larger cash outs for sick leave are done, it'll be a little bit more manageable. But if we can go back to that previous slide. Mm-hmm. So the blue box on the right is really kind of telling us where we are. Now remember, at one point, 100% of employees got the sick leave payout. So now on the general government side, we're down to like 19 employees. We're down, police are 6, and this is as of June 30th. So since June 30th, a couple of these employees who are eligible for the sick leave payout have since left. And the same with fire, 7, and then 33. So we're down to less than 10% of the employees for this particular benefit. So this has drastically reduced that liability. So that's how leave at termination works. And so with the funding for this year, I want to take another look at it. I want to see where we are. Most likely there will not be any increase in that particular area, but I want to take a better look at and do a little analysis on that before giving that information to the departments. So now the health insurance works very, very similarly. Again, we have 2 plans. We have the city side employees are on Health Trust, and then the school department employees are on School Care, but they kind of both work the same. So we're kind of self-employed. We're part of a pool. Our rates are based on predominantly based on our experience of the members that are on our plan. And you're going to remember our retirees. Many of our retirees are also on this plan. So the same thing. We try to come up with a budget for the departments. So we took out the actual expenditures within the departments, moved it over to the stabilization fund, and then the past policy was to take the 10-year rolling average, and as you can see from the chart, it's up, it's down, it's up and down. So we took the 10-year rolling average added that to the previous budget for the departments. And then, again, if there was surplus in the fund, it would go to fund balance. If there was a deficit, it would be taken from reserve. Now, this worked great for a number of years, but really over time, and we started to tweak it a little bit last year, but really over time, it's like it didn't, the way we handled that policy didn't really take in consideration the total amount of FTEs. So if there was a reduction in FTEs or an increase in FTEs, so some of this was starting to fall a little bit behind. So last year we made some movement, we changed it a little bit, and again, I want to look at it again for this year. The Health Trust is going up a guaranteed maximum rate of 5.4%. They will adjust that number, I think in early spring or somewhere in there, that they'll give us what their actual rate is. I think it's usually April, but the guaranteed maximum rate will be 5.4. But the school care is pretty much locked in at the, does that say 2.8? I can't read it. 2.8, I think.
3.9.
3.9. Okay. So it works very similarly. I'm still working on the numbers to see if there would be an increase. We are underfunding it from the actual amount within the departments, and we did underfund it last year as well, knowing that will be utilized from reserve. So,
Judy, is it
yes.
possible just to clarify how, just quickly, how the way we self-insure is different than how a family might receive health care through their employee? Just talk about how we actually pay for these total costs.
Okay, so we're part of the pool, and it's managed by Health Trust, and it's taken consideration across the state and all of the other communities that are in here. So there's a certain, Kelly Harper could answer this question a little bit better than I, but from what I understand, there's a certain portion of the claims. So it depends on the number of claims that you use, and the utilization is how they base your experience. So there is a certain portion of the more catastrophic claims, and they're kind of pooled against the whole state. And then there's another section of claims that just go within the members of Portsmouth. And so that's how they base the rate. And actually, the guaranteed maximum rate they gave Portsmouth, 5.4, I believe, is lower than they gave the overall at over 6%.
But let me add to that a little bit. The pandemic really threw a wrench into all of this because many fewer people were going to the doctor and having insurance needs. So it was sort of a false sense of what was really going on. The other thing I wanted to make sure you mentioned is premium holidays.
Yeah, okay. So there was a lawsuit back 2012 or somewhere in that time frame where I think it was the Fire Association had gone to the state and said, the insurance rates are going up and up, your fund balance is being retained. So if your community or your employees didn't use or utilize all of those premiums and the claims weren't coming in, they were putting all of that money into their fund balance. So there was a lawsuit that said, okay, they can, and I don't know what the level is, I think it's 12%, maybe 15%, but they're only allowed to maintain a certain level of their fund balance at the end of the day. So if they had, which happened during COVID, is people weren't utilizing their health insurance, there weren't enough claims out there, so there was a bigger pocket of money that went into their reserve. So they have to refund to the members that gap between what they're allowed to keep in their fund balance and the amount of premiums they collected less their claims and less their fees. So they call it holiday premium. It's kind of a strange name, but they call it a holiday premium. So the last couple of years, because of that, we have received, and this is why we were able to kind of reduce health insurance a little bit last year, is we received health premium. Now, this is a refund. It's a refunded premium. So Retirees pay 100% of their premiums, so we mail them a check for their refund. Employees also pay a portion, so we had to figure out what that portion was, so employees would get a little bit back, and then the city received the remaining amount for the holiday premium. So we're seeing that again this year, and this is why I want to do a little bit more analysis on it, but this is not going to continue, especially if we climb out of this COVID environment. It's not going to be as large as it was, and so we want to be mindful of that as we look at health insurance going forward. So the New Hampshire retirement system. So a little bit of good news for this fiscal year. They usually set their rates. They do a biennium budget. So they set their rates every 2 years. Last year we saw a significant increase in the retirement, the employees' portion for the retirement. As you can see here, police pays the highest percentage of 33.88%. So for every dollar a fireman makes, 33.88 cents goes to the retirement system. But we're not seeing an increase in here, so the only increase in retirement in the budget process would be due to any COLA adjustments or any step increases or some FTE changes, whether increased or decreased. So that would be that there too. Now, the New Hampshire retirement system had a couple of things going, and there's a couple of reasons why our rates are so high. One is that prior to fiscal year 10, the state contributed 35% of the employees' contributions for teachers, police, and fire personnel. So they had set legislation, they wanted to basically eliminate that contribution, and really got pushed down to the local communities for this cost. So in FY11, their obligation was reduced to 25%, and then after fiscal year 12, the state reduced its obligation to 0, and it hasn't come back since. There's been talk about it. Apparently, there's a House bill right now, 1417, that they would like the state to start reinstating a small portion, 7.5% for teachers, police, and fire personnel. I know Jane Farini will be addressing this with the legislative subcommittee, but it's not very hopeful that this is going to go through. So this is something that the subcommittee could, maybe keep an eye on and research that and see where that's going to go. It got killed the last time, but it's back on the table for a little bit. This will be very helpful. The other piece why the rates are so high is the unfunded liability. And I know Alina Corset had mentioned this and talked about this during the audit presentation. There is a piece of the unfunded liability that we're paying for within the rates, and it really varies. It's like 70 to 85% of these rates is really going to that unfunded liability portion. So if that didn't occur, the pension rates here would be a lot lower. Okay, so another area which helps stabilize budgets was the cost of living adjustment. So first I'll bring your attention to the right-hand side of the screen, which has we utilize the November to November Boston Cambridge CPI, and what was negotiated in all of the collective bargaining agreements is that we'll take the 10 years of that November compared to the previous November to November rate, take 10 years, average that. So also in the collective bargaining agreements is also a stipulation, excuse me, that there is a floor of 2%. So if that 10-year average dropped below 2%, the COLA would be 2%. And then there's a ceiling at 5%. So with the 10-year average, the CPI is 5.31%, the November to November, but the 10-year average is 2.05. Social Security COLA adjustment currently is 5.9%. The left chart identifies all our collective bargaining agreements. So we have 16. The ones that are highlighted in tan are the ones that will expire this June. So going into the fiscal year 23 budget, currently those contracts will have expired. Current salaries across the board, fire, police, school, and this includes all full-time, part-time, overtime, holiday, stipends, education, is $51.6 million, benefits of $14.3 million. So this slide here is just kind of grouping the operating side of the budget. You know, the city manager will be working with each one of these departments. We've had brief discussions on the budget going forward. But we need to pull together. We're actually having another department head meeting on Thursday to talk about the FY23 budget. But some of the items that might impact the budget would be really salary adjustments across the board, right? So your general government, police, fire, and school. And then on the general government side, and I don't know, Karen, if you want to speak to any of these, but.
Happy to speak to at least government, general government side, and feel free to lean on the chief and Karen if you have any PD questions. But in addition to salary adjustments that may be recommended by staff, it would be important to point out at this early juncture that in this coming budget, we will have exhausted the city's UDAG line of funding, which was managed in repayment of loan funds. UDAG is a former federal grant program. Believe it or not, that fund has been funding the Economic Development Manager position and a few other items for, Judy would have to even give decades, a whole long time. Essentially, long story short, the fund will be exhausted. And in order to continue to pay an Economic Development Manager, we will need to attribute or account for that in the budget in the general fund this year and not take advantage of the UDAG fund, which will have been depleted. Similarly, the inspection group is looking to add a full-time inspector, and I think that might sell itself. As you all know, we're coming up to speed and trying to bring the department back in line and be much more responsive to the overwhelming need in that area. Public Works is looking to reposition some classifications. A good example that we've shared with you before is if you're a water sewer plant operator or an engineer, it's a completely different story with a $91 million state-of-the-art wastewater treatment plant, and the type of salaried, experienced employee that we need is something we aren't able to currently address. We've mentioned to you before that we're looking to build and make more robust our information technology as a real department, and something that we haven't accounted for yet, but it's early still, and budgets still have to be formulated, is how we handle the procurement of PPE across all departments. But as you can see, police and schools are similar in costs that they can anticipate now, whether it be human resources or training or agreements related to financial software or things of the like. The school department has been discussing and will continue to discuss the restoration of certain cuts and different changes in their staffing as well. But in the blue box are things we know to be true as things that are always on the table and under consideration. Judy's talked about some of them. Some things we haven't talked about is potential needs that are going to be larger this coming year for Prescott Park. Obviously, with the community campus coming online, that's a whole new building we've never taken care of. And then the future anticipated needs at places like McIntyre.
Okay. So now more on the non-operating side of the budget. So when it comes to funding capital projects, there are kind of two approaches that we utilize that have an impact on the budget. Capital outlay is one approach. These are projects that are identified in the capital improvement plan, adopted by the planning board, and then ultimately adopted by the city council. We call this your pay-as-you-go basis. So this is your cash basis. The policy that has been in practice is to budget no more than 2% of the prior year's appropriation for capital outlay. So as you can see, the blue bar bar way over to the right, right now, what's been identified is $1.8 million. This is 1.47%, so it hasn't reached that 2%. But also, if you look at it in comparison to the previous years, it's noted very clearly here that the last 2 fiscal years, this particular area has been reduced for obvious reasons.
I'll spend a moment on this slide. It's hard to read on the big screen, but if you have the handout in front of you, and we will make this available on the city website as well. These are the items that comprise the 1.84 million. And of note, about a third of the way down would be the Greenland Road Recreation Facility. As we've talked about, there is a 2.2 million supplemental appropriation that was passed after this was laid out as one of the items in capital outlay. So depending on how that is expended and the funds from which, this item could stay in or come out of next year's capital outlay. Similarly, about 2/3 of the way down, sound barriers in the residential area along I-95. The city was initially told we would need to provide a match, and that number of $100,000 represents the match. But depending on the way that the funding is recognized by the state, the match on our part may not be needed. So those are 2 good examples of moving targets, if you will. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Judy.
Well, and actually, once, once it's adopted, and it's adopted this way, it will be presented in the budget document like this, but it's not cut in stone until you adopt the budget. So there's still room to talk about these projects and make some changes, if you will. The second approach is for funding of capital projects is debt service, issuing bonds. So the city's policy is to use no more than 10% of the annual appropriation towards net debt service payments to keep debt manageable. If you recall hearing from Alina Korsak during the audit presentation, the word manageable is actually a good term. So it's a good term that's, and this is really specific to Portsmouth. I'm sure other communities have some kind of mechanism to manage their debt. By law, we really only have to follow the state statute, which we are well below the debt limit from the RSA standpoint. But we also incorporated this policy. And what this does is just help project out and manage your future debt. So although this chart shows right now for FY23 through the CIP with current and projected debt, we're at 8.91%. But if you look out to the future to like fiscal year 28, you see it creeps over 10%. That doesn't mean it's going to be 10% because we go through the CIP process every year. Things change, priorities and initiatives change. So this is just a guideline to say, hey, we're getting up to the 10% or passing the 10%. We need to do a little bit more work. So, and that helps keep debt very manageable. The rolling stock program, there's really no number to the rolling stock program or a percentage at this point. But what this slide shows you is this is just an example of how we manage our rolling stock. This is citywide, so this will include all our vehicles for water and sewer, Prescott Park, and then all of general fund departments. In the back of your budget book, there's an appendix. It has an inventory of all your vehicles and equipment. It has the purchase price, the age, and this is just illustration. This is just an example, but I just wanted to do a little clip it to show you how we manage this. And then the bottom part, and also in your appendix, is the replacement schedule. So this is where we identify the useful life and where we're gonna roll these aging equipment out over time. Now again, this can change. It's a managed tool. The next slide shows what we've done in the last few years since fiscal year 18. So again, right now, the $1.1 million number is really what has been requested to the city manager from the department. City manager has not at this time currently sat down, and this is going to be part of our process in the very near future to see what this equipment is and see what she wants to present in the upcoming proposed budget. As you can see, just like with capital outlay, fiscal year 21 and 22, we really put a hold and pushed out some of the replacement vehicles to be mindful of COVID and what we're going through there.
It's fair to say that that 1.183 projected or proposed or things that have been asked for is, to a certain extent, playing catch-up with the 2 previous years where we really put the brakes on the replacement schedule and certain needs. So that's something we'll weigh as a group and make thoughtful decisions about before coming to you. So that 1.18 will most likely change. Almost done.
Almost done. So I believe that's like pretty much the Rockingham County is the last non-operating item that I'll speak to tonight. So Rockingham County is a big number for us in Portsmouth. How it is calculated is twofold. It's whatever the county adopts their budget at, their tax levy portion, and that will be distributed amongst all 37 communities in Rockingham County. It's based on the population is how it's distributed, and it's based on the equalized value. So this chart shows all 37 communities. Portsmouth is the 4th most populous community, but we pay the highest percentage, and last year we paid 11.4% of that proportion for the Rockingham County obligation tax. And then the next slide shows our history of the Rockingham County obligation. I will say that one of the things that the Rockingham County did to us is we were able to track it a little bit better because they used to be on a calendar year, January to December. And so their budget meetings were in January and February. We were able to really monitor what they were coming in with their budget. And then we had some idea as we got closer to setting the tax rate of where we're going to be in the equalized value state. But a couple of years ago, the state allowed them to change their fiscal year. So now they're on the same fiscal year as we are, July 1 to June 30th. So now their budget meetings really kind of coincide with your budget meetings. So it's a little bit harder for us to predict. But ultimately, though, it really always changes a little bit by the time we set the tax rate. So those aren't official until the October-November timeframe. So during the budget process, we'll utilize a number to our best estimate, but most likely it will change. For fiscal year 22, we budgeted $5.8 million. As you can see on this chart, it came in at $5.67 million. So there'll be some budgetary savings in that area for county. But we certainly don't want it to go the other way. And then the last slide just kind of groups what we just talked about on the non-operating side, debt service, what we're predicting right now or estimating right now, a change of 1.1 million, rolling stock, just under 600,000, IT upgrades, 197,000, and then capital outlay, this 760,000. Doesn't mean this is what's going to be presented to you in the proposed budget, but this is what we're looking at right now.
So with that, Judy and I, of course, would be happy to answer any question, but we would also want you to know that starting Thursday and traipsing right through the month of February, we will meet with every department, get a better handle on things they absolutely need, things they'd like to see. We're going to pay particular attention to efficiencies they can achieve or things we can do cross-department by way of cross-training or shared services. The department heads have gotten really nimble, certainly during a pandemic, in figuring out what they need to have and what and what makes them run as efficiently as possible. So we'll be meeting to review and refine things that we all know to be, and we'll bring those to you as we have them, but we would obviously love your feedback both tonight and on a going forward basis as we look to develop a budget that reflects not only the values we talked about on Saturday, but the realities of things we need to provide in terms of core services. So with that, we will stop talking.
Okay, so we'll open it up to questions, Counselor Cook, you have your hand up. And no ground rules. Feel free to ask whatever you guys want on this.
Thank you, Mayor. So I have a question about the unexpected expenditure that occurred out of general fund balance at the end of the year, the $2.2 million skate park expenditure. If we leave that in the current CIP budget, which we just saw, and it's funded in that manner, and therefore those funds, my understanding, return to the general fund, how does that impact that $95 million tax assessment?
So, the tax levy that's on that sheet for 95 million.
Yes.
That is still offset, so the piece, so as you look at the expenditures, so it increased to 125 million. On the revenue side, on the bottom of that slide, the use of fund balance also increased. So there was no tax effect.
Okay.
Okay, and the tax rate was already established, so that's really, with a supplemental appropriation, you have a couple choices, which I've never seen here. If you need a supplemental appropriation, one, you send out a new tax bill to people, which you don't want to do, or two, take it out of your fund balance. So it has no tax effect.
Can I follow up with that? So I guess my follow-on question then is, it would return us back to a 13.6% reserve rate. Is that correct? Where we were prior to that expenditure for this year?
So it all depends on what happens at the end of the year, as of June 30th, and it depends on what the council chooses to do. If one to reserve or encumber that money, then no, it would not fold back to fund balance. And also see if there's any other revenue or expenditure surplus. We use the debt service reserve every year too, so we like to also replenish that so that doesn't eventually run out. But there's one or two things to do, and that will be a council decision.
Any other questions? This is a lot to take in. We'll go through it twice as a council. I still learn as I've watched it now sitting through this the third time. So questions can arise, and we will certainly have opportunity to address them. But if there's not any further questions, I will move on to public comment.
There's no one here from the public. Kevin, is there anyone on Zoom that wishes to offer comment?
Not at this time. Maybe everybody's celebrating Poppy getting into the Hall of Fame.
Mayor, if I can offer once again that both Judy and I would be available for one-on-one questions. No question is too big or too small. You can lump them together or just come at us every time you have a question.
Assistant Mayor, I don't know what that sound was, but it wasn't coming from you, but do you have a question?
Yeah, Judy, can you explain a little bit more how the Rockingham County tax, how that is calculated, how they calculate it? As you mentioned, we only have the fourth highest population, but pay a staggering amount more than.
Yes. So that piece is based off your equalized value. So they provide a list of all the communities, their equalized value, and I say they, the state. So they once those equalized values, and what they try and do when they equalize the values, we have our local values, and then the Department of Revenue does their calculation to equalize, to try to bring all the communities, so you're comparing apples to apples, so kind of up to 100%. So if you look at the equalized value, it's going to differ than what we say our local value is. So the state uses those equalized values for a number of reasons, to distribute different taxes and revenues. It's also used in the process of the statewide property tax issue. So then they take take all the 37, and then they just kind of weigh them out. What portion of your equalized value is the total? Then they take that percentage. So last year, we were 11%. So even though I think Derry has a higher population, but their equalized value might be lower. So then that's distributed to the piece that's to be raised in tax obligations on the county side. So the county has a similar thing. They have their local revenues. They get revenues from for the nursing home and they, for the jails and whatnot. So they have a piece that is really just their tax levy that's distributed amongst these 37 communities.
Thank you.
So Judy, stating that another way, we, through the equalized property, we represent a greater portion of property value in Rockingham County, and as such are required to pay as a percentage higher than other cities because their property is not valued by the state as highly as our property.
Well, their total value is just going to be made up so differently because the equalization actually brings them up to the same level. Like, I want to say 100% value, market value kind of thing. So that's what the whole equalization process does is bring them up so they're comparable. But some of these communities are just smaller. So their values are not as high overall as Portsmouth.
The numbers, yeah.
You want to add anything?
Did I see a question from Councilor Tabor? Now we're going back, so we've had public comment, but now nobody having any public comments said, okay, we got a chance to ask some more questions. So we're back on question and answers. I'll allow it here, Councilor Tabor.
We're back for more. One comment is that Judy and her staff are wonderful when you have questions. They're prompt, they research them, and I've asked a lot of detailed questions over the years. That's Judy knows. I always have trouble understanding the difference between the budget year and the tax year. Would it be fair to characterize it as we finish a budget, and then in November we assess the tax bill for half of that year, and we're paying in arrears. We're paying for the.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Dover and Portsmouth, I believe, are the only two communities that are do it that way. And it had to do with a state statute from many, many years ago when I think when they changed the fiscal year to a July 1 to a June 30th, way before I started working here. But Dover and Portsmouth are the same. So when they set their tax rate in November, it's the first tax bill. Oftentimes, it's the second tax bill for other communities. So in essence, our fiscal year has started, right? So we're funding 6 months into the fiscal year before we collect any tax revenue.
Yeah.
So that's how that works. All the assessments are based as of April 1st. So the tax year is different, it's off, but the fiscal year is July 1 to June 30. So our first tax bill is December, the second tax bill is June.
Okay.
And again, Dover and Portsmouth are the only ones. I got a head shake, so.
Oh, yes, I deal with this on a daily basis.
Yes, and you might be able to,
So most of the cities, in case you're interested, most of the towns and cities in New Hampshire actually have the first tax bill in July is half of the previous year, and then they set the rate in the fall, and then they figure out what the whole tax bill, and in December, they just pay the difference.
right,
Dover and Portsmouth do it very differently, because the actual tax year is April 1st to March 31st.
right, because when they do it, when the other communities, when they send their tax bills, it's an estimated tax bill, right? They're estimating it. So then when you get your second bill, they finalize their tax rate and they say, okay, here's your balance that you owe.
Yep. It's fun.
I'm glad we have something in common with Dover.
We do, yes, they're
It
both
never
a
goes
pain.
down on the second one.
It's always a pain to explain that every time you close a loan.
Yes, and it is hard. So, and we get a lot of calls in the tax office for closing when it's related to
I always tell them, don't call the
taxes.
tax office, call
It's,
me.
yeah, and we're really not supposed to, do that calculation. We always refer those calls back to the realtor or to the title company. And
Are there any other questions that we have? And again, you don't have to funnel any questions through the city manager. You can reach out directly to Judy and the finance team, as you can with the city legal department. They are a resource to the council. I think it's good to have the types, any question that you have, we'll make an effort to answer in public as well, though, because for every question that you ask, there's 100 other people that want to know the answer at home. And so our job is to ask the questions that we might even sometimes know the answer to, in order to make sure that the public is being served in this process. And then I guess as we adjourn this, I want to thank the staff for the opportunity to discuss at our retreat our goals. Very excited to have our goals come together as a council and then stress test them with the public so that the public can understand, our values really through our budget and the goals that we hope to achieve through that budget. I'm excited to put those forth and have public comment on them. But with that, unless there's any other questions, I will adjourn. Thank you very much. Good night, Portsmouth.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question unrelated to this?